Hi, everyone. The second topic that I want to cover with regard to the American homefront experience has to do with what happened to Japanese Americans during the war, who were rounded up and placed into concentration camps, talking about 120,000 people, two-thirds of whom were American citizens. And this was one of the worst violations of civil liberties in American history. And to help you understand why that happened, I'm going to do a short introduction to it by looking at American attitudes about the Pacific War. So, in our Zoom session, I showed this slide to the class and asked if anyone recognized this. Then I moved to this slide, which revealed that these are both pictures from a popular TV sitcom of the mid-1960s called Hogan's Heroes. And the show centered around an American officer, Colonel Hogan, here in the center, played by an actor named Bob Crane, who was a real creep in real life. But he was the leader of this assorted group of Allied prisoners, and they were prisoners in this Nazi POW camp, prisoner of war camp. The two German officers that you saw in the previous slide, who were prominent characters in the show, were both idiots and both stereotypes based on long-running stereotypes of German people, going back to depictions on the vaudeville stage, late 19th and early 20th century America. But I've always found it fascinating that you could have a comedy based on this whole premise, with the setting a Nazi prisoner of war camp, even though we know that Nazi treatment of prisoners of war from all nations was terrible during World War II, particularly Soviet prisoners. And yet this could be the basis of a popular comedy show 20 years later in the 1960s. So I asked the class to think about, why don't we have an equivalent show of this type with the setting a Japanese run prisoner of war camp, where Americans were held captive by Japanese, where the treatment was terrible too, just like it was in German POW camps. But why couldn't we have that as a setting for a successful sitcom? Well, part of the answer to that has to do with American attitudes about the Pacific War. And what I explained to the class was that with regard to the war in Europe, Americans understood they were part of an Allied coalition and that the purpose of the war was to defeat Nazi Germany. And Americans were cognizant of the fact that the bulk of the fighting was being done by Soviet forces. The United States, of course, made critically important contributions, but the number of American troops engaged at any one time in the war in Europe was quite small in comparison to the size of Soviet forces fighting on the Eastern Front. So we were seen as part of this coalition. The idea is to defeat Nazi Germany. As I've mentioned in class, Americans differentiated between good Germans and bad Germans. There was kind of this attitude that, the Nazis were bad Germans, but that wasn't all Germans. And that only changes really late in the war with the discovery of concentration camps, and particularly the death camps that the Nazis built in Poland that were liberated by Soviet troops. Then you have a change attitudinally. In contrast with the Pacific War, Americans always viewed this completely differently. First, it was seen as our war. And even though Allied nations made important contributions, the bulk of the fighting, the preponderance of the forces in the Pacific War were Americans, and Americans, as I said, doing the bulk of the fighting there. And because of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the purpose of the war in the Pacific against Japan, it was defined completely differently than the war in Europe. You see in this propaganda poster the expression of a theme that was emphasized repeatedly during the war, and that is that the purpose of the Pacific War went beyond defeating Japan. It wasn't just defeating Japan that was the purpose. The United States had to avenge the attack on Pearl Harbor. We had to gain revenge for what had happened. And that's a much more problematic concept. It's much more difficult to define. How do you quantify? How do you measure when a nation has inflicted sufficient damage on an enemy to claim that we've achieved revenge, that we've reached the point that we can declare vengeance achieved? It's very, very hard to define. And I think this is one of the elements that made the Pacific War so difficult to end in 1945. So these attitudes play out in a variety of ways, and I'll show you just a few examples of other wartime propaganda posters. The term Japanese was seldom spelled out during the war. Instead, you saw these racist terms, Jap and Nip, widely used in not only propaganda posters like this, but in regular features and in headlines in newspapers and magazines. Animalistic depictions of Japanese that dehumanized them were pervasive during the war. This example, again, using the term Jap, and depicting Japanese as mice, rats, lice, cockroaches, any sort of vermin you can think of, was widespread, extremely common. And often a part of that were also the characteristics that you see here. The buck teeth, the thick glasses, those were common renderings too in illustrations and propaganda posters from throughout the war. This is a last example of this, and I used this in class, and I find this interesting for a variety of reasons. On the left, you have an illustration from Saturday Evening Post from a story, How Tough Are the Japanese? And this was published in early 1942 when the war was not going well for the United States. And so you have this depiction of a Japanese soldier as a primate, as a gorilla, all the way down to the depiction of his hands. And this is imagery that would have been familiar to Americans because it would have conjured up memories of a popular film from 1933, King Kong. That's exactly what this soldier looks like. Now, within a year, by 1943, when the war has turned against Japan and in the favor of the United States, you have these same depictions here, two downed Japanese pilots depicted as primates, but now, instead of this conquering gorilla, they've been reduced to being these harmless and really kind of comical-looking chimpanzees. And notice the plane in the background that's been shot down, depicted as kind of primitive, having these wings made of sails. That's another theme that you see a lot in the American media during the war, this tendency to depict Japan and Japanese as technologically backward in comparison to Americans. So these depictions exhibit racist thinking. They're also closely tied to this concept of wanting to achieve revenge, avenging Pearl Harbor. And these attitudes are going to influence what happens to Japanese Americans here in the United States.